This is every single book in the entire history of Middle-earth series. That is 12 volumes and over 5,000 pages, which is quite a lot, and it took me about a year and a half to read it all. Now, in this video, I wanted to talk about the history of Middle-earth series, what it's all about, my experience reading it, and just, I don't know, my overall thoughts on it. So I started this series way back in 2024. And I read books 1 through 5 fairly quickly. Took a little bit of a break for 2 or 3 months. And then I delved back into the series. I read books 6 through 9 fairly quickly. And then I took a bit more of a break and then read the final 3 volumes over the course of 5 or 6 months. And it took me a long while to get through these last 3 volumes because there was so much in there. And this series isn't a series that you can sort of speed read through. It's a series that you really have to take your time with, because I feel like if I just sped through them like any ordinary book, then I probably wouldn't have remembered a lot of what I had read, and I probably would have gotten really exhausted from reading as well. So I didn't try to speed through it. But first of all, I just want to talk about what this series is actually about. So this book series is not a story. It is not the history of Middle-earth. The Silmarillion is more of the actual history of Middle-earth. And this series is not the history of the actual world of Middle-earth. It is the history of how Tolkien wrote about the world of Middle-earth, how his idea of his created world of Arda evolved over time. And it started out as just light-hearted fairy tales that Tolkien wanted to tell, and slowly and steadily it grew into something so much larger and grander than Tolkien had ever anticipated. Oof. Now, I really enjoyed these first 2 volumes of this series, which is The Book of Lost Tales, Part 1 and Part 2. And these are stories that Tolkien wrote while he was still a young man in his early 20s, just after having fought in World War I. And Tolkien wanted to create fairy tales of his own. He was inspired by stories like Beowulf and lots of Norse mythology to create a mythology of his own. And that is how he initially intended Middle-earth, although back then it was not called Middle-earth yet. But the Book of Lost Tales is basically the earliest versions of the Silmarillion, of the stories that make up the Silmarillion. Only they're very different. Now, throughout the entire history of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's son, this entire series was published posthumously, and Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, found all these manuscripts in his father's office, and he published them in this series. He also published them in books like The Silmarillion and The Children of Húrin, etc. But this series provides so many earlier drafts and different versions of Lord of the Rings, of The Silmarillion, and just of so much other material. And it is incredible that Christopher Tolkien literally leaves nothing out. He is so very thorough in searching through his father's manuscript. And J.R.R. Tolkien had horrible handwriting, even worse than mine, in fact. When Tolkien was writing rather quickly, when he had a good idea, his handwriting is illegible to understand. I tried reading his handwriting once, but I could not do it because it is horrible, even worse than mine, which is saying quite a lot. And it's so amazing that Christopher Tolkien, he talks about trying to read all these manuscripts with a magnifying glass until he could figure out what they say. And I can't imagine how laborious and tedious that was. And he did it not just for 1 book, but for 5,000 entire pages published across the series. But I'm kind of rambling a bit. So, the Book of Lost Tales is like the stories in the Silmarillion, only they are very different. A lot of the names are different, some of the events are different, And it is so interesting reading Tolkien's original idea for Middle-earth. And the Book of Lost Tales has sort of that feel that old fairy tales like George MacDonald and like Cinderella have. They're very reminiscent of just old fairy tales, and they don't feel a lot like the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings. And the Book of Lost Tales I really enjoyed. It was so interesting. Christopher Tolkien provided amazing in-depth commentary that I really enjoyed throughout these 2 volumes. Just, it is so fascinating reading about all of this. And yeah, I really love the Book of Lost Tales. And Tolkien actually abandoned the Book of Lost Tales, and he would later rename it the Silmarillion. But after the Book of Lost Tales, Christopher Tolkien published The Lays of Beleriand. Now, The Lays of Beleriand is a collection of a whole bunch of lays. And if you're unfamiliar with the term... gack! The book just fell down. Get back up here. Yeah, this book, it's a long story. So, long story short, this book actually split in half, which I am disappointed about. But I want to get a new copy of this eventually, and I will need to because it split in half once. Very fragile binding. But anyway, so the Lays of Beleriand. The word lay is like a fancy term for a very long poem. So like Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, those would be considered lays. Beowulf is a lay as well. And Tolkien wrote lays, or really long poems, for his stories such as The Children of Húrin and Beren and Luthien. And he also wrote a little bit of a long poem for The Fall of Gondolin as well, and a little bit of a lay for the story of Eärendil, which takes place at the end of the Silmarillion. And I think that The Lay of Luthien, which is the really long poem about Beren and Luthien, how long is it? It's like over 3,000, it's 4,000 lines long, and Tolkien never even finished it. It's so sad that Tolkien never finished it, but I am so grateful that we have what we have of the poem, because it is some of the greatest, in fact, it is the greatest poetry I have ever read. I think this is probably my favorite volume in the History of Middle-earth series, because I loved all of the poems. It's just the greatest poetry that I have ever read in my entire life. Really unfortunate that Tolkien left a lot of these poems unfinished. And something that's really interesting is The Lay of Luthien is a poem in which every line rhymes with the one before it. But in The Lay of the Children of Húrin, Tolkien wrote it in alliterative form, which means that instead of making the poem rhyme with the line before it, he uses alliteration in every line. And it's so interesting. I've tried writing poetry both in like rhyming poetry and alliterative poetry. Alliterative poetry is much easier to write, but I think I prefer rhyming poetry. And what I mean by that is that for me it is easier writing alliterative poetry, but I enjoy the experience of reading rhyming poetry much better, because I feel like poetry that rhymes in every line or every other line just sounds so much better than alliterative poetry. Although alliterative poetry can be beautiful as well, and it's certainly far easier for me to write than rhyming poetry. But rhyming poetry is much more beautiful for me. And yeah, I prefer rhyming poetry, but it is easier to write alliterative poetry. And The Lay of Luthien is the greatest poem I have ever read in my entire life. I'm going to say it. The Lay of Luthien is the greatest poem I've ever read in my entire life, even though it's unfinished. But we have 4,000 beautiful lines of writing that just Tolkien did such a great job on. But the next volume, Volume 4, is The Shaping of Middle-earth. Now, I didn't find this volume to be as interesting as the previous 3, but it was still such a great book. Now, in this book, you can really see Tolkien's writing... Oh, gack, he almost fell down too. You can really see Tolkien's writing about Middle-earth evolving from the sort of fairy tales that are in the Book of Lost Tales into what we now know Middle-earth as. This book feels a lot more like the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings and just Middle-earth as we know it. And this is when Middle-earth truly began to take its full shape and form, and Tolkien started to dive really, really deeply into everything in his world and discovered so much more about it. So this is really a great book. Just in my opinion, not as interesting as the first 3 volumes, but still just amazing. And the next one is probably next to the Peoples of Middle-earth. So next to the 9th volume and the final volume of the History of Middle-earth, this is by far the most fascinating to me. It is The Lost Road and Other Writings, Volume 5. Now, the first part of this book has an unfinished story called The Lost Road. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the story, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were great friends. C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Chronicles of Narnia, Out of the Silent Planet, Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, and many other books. And so C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were having a chat one day at the pub, and they decided that they would have a contest to see who could write a better story. They decided one of them would write a space travel story and the other would write a time travel story. Well, they flipped a coin. They literally flipped a coin. C.S. Lewis just took a coin out of his pocket and flipped it for which one of them would write which story. And the coin decided that C.S. Lewis would write the story about space travel and Tolkien would write the story about time travel. Now, when C.S. Lewis wrote his space travel story, it came into the Space Trilogy, which is published today. So C.S. Lewis actually finished the Space Trilogy. But Tolkien's time travel story he called The Lost Road, and he actually left it unfinished, only 4 chapters into it. But those 4 chapters are so fascinating to read in this book. It's so unfortunate that Tolkien never finished it. Like, Tolkien left a lot of his works unfinished because he just felt like there's a lot of things wrong with them, or he got too busy with writing something else. But The Lost Road is so good. At least the 4 chapters that we have of it. Now, instead of being like a typical science fiction time travel story, this is much more of a... It has sort of the feel that the Book of Lost Tales has. It is a father and his son who travel back in time through their dreams. It is such great stuff, so fascinating. The prose and dialogue is amazing. There's this one scene with Elendil in Numenor talking to his son Isildur that is just so fascinating. And we I don't think we get any dialogue from Elendil or Isildur very much besides in this. I think The Lost Road might be the only place where we actually get dialogue from Elendil. Or at least the only place where we get extended dialogue from Elendil. So that's really great, and then the rest of The Lost Road is just more of the history of the Silmarillion. Tolkien spent so much time developing the Silmarillion. A lot of people refer to The Lord of the Rings as his life's work. And The Lord of the Rings, it took 17 years to write. Tolkien spent a lot of time and hard work into it, but his heart was much more with the Silmarillion. And I think that the Silmarillion is much more his life's work than The Lord of the Rings is. He spent so much time developing the Silmarillion, and it's so fascinating. A lot of the names he changed, a lot of the histories he changed, and in this volume, you can really start to see how Middle-earth has evolved from the fairy tales in the Book of Lost Tales into what it is becoming now. And The Lost Road is really when Middle-earth becomes Middle-earth. Now, the next book is called The Return of the Shadow. Now, this book was so interesting. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but with all these volumes, it's so interesting. Now, this book, The Shaping of Middle-earth, not The Shaping Middle-earth, The Return of the Shadow, this one delves into the history of The Lord of the Rings, of how Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. And in this book, we get all the earlier drafts for The Lord of the Rings, and all of Tolkien's outlines for it. We see it mostly focuses on the hobbits and their early journey, and it ends at around the time where they come to Rivendell. But it is amazing how much Tolkien rewrote stuff, and this book was really interesting because The Lord of the Rings started out, when Tolkien started writing it, it started out so much differently than what it is now when it became published in its final form. For example, Just one of the strange things with this original version of The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien was writing, Strider, or Aragorn, was actually a hobbit who wore wooden shoes, and his name was Trotter. And it's so interesting because you can see Tolkien's thought process behind The Lord of the Rings. You see him crossing things out. Christopher Tolkien included everything in here. Every draft, every little revision and correction that Tolkien made. And this is the earliest versions of The Lord of the Rings. It has a much more whimsical feel to it, kind of like The Hobbit and the Book of Lost Tales. And this is before Tolkien even realized that Lord of the Rings was Middle-earth. Something that I learned while reading this series is that when Tolkien wrote the earlier stories of the Silmarillion, which is, the Book of Lost Tales, and some of the stuff that we find in The Shaping of Middle-earth and The Lost Road, and then when he wrote The Hobbit, he didn't actually intend for The Hobbit to be in the same world as Middle-earth. And it was only when he started writing The Lord of the Rings that he realized that this was in the exact same world as the Silmarillion. So that was so interesting. This book was really interesting. Like, the original names for the hobbits are so different. Frodo's name is Bingo, and it is so different from the published Lord of the Rings, which I just find to be so interesting. And if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, but you aren't as familiar with, the stories in the Silmarillion, then you can definitely start the history of Middle-earth by reading this. And I think you'll find it a lot more interesting than the earlier volumes if you're more experienced with the Lord of the Rings, and you haven't read the Silmarillion, or you have and you haven't really understood it, then this is a great place to start with the history of Middle-earth, because you can see Tolkien's original thought behind Lord of the Rings, you can read all the earlier drafts, all Tolkien's outlines, such fascinating stuff. And Christopher Tolkien's commentary and notes and footnotes on everything is just so amazing as well. And the 7th volume is called The Treason of Isengard. Now this book is when Tolkien fully realized that the Lord of the Rings was the same world as the Silmarillion. And there's a lot of geographical stuff in here. Tolkien wrote so much about geography in here. He wrote a lot about Dwarvish runes, the Elvish language. And you also see a lot of the earlier drafts and outlines and notes for the Two Towers as well, which is the second book in The Lord of the Rings. And again, it's pretty different from The Lord of the Rings that we know today. For example, Treebeard was originally a giant who was evil and on Sauron's side. And in the original versions, Treebeard actually kidnapped Gandalf in Fangorn Forest, which is so interesting. And Tolkien also put in a lot of time schemes for when things took place, what the phases of the moon was. It's so incredible how much thought Tolkien put into his world of Middle-earth. And you almost get the sense that Middle-earth is such a real place because it is such a well-developed world, and Tolkien put so much thought and detail behind even the smallest things. I love this as well. Volume 8 is called The War of the Ring. And this book delves primarily into the history of how Tolkien wrote The Return of the King. And now in this one, it is much more similar to The Lord of the Rings that we know today. And it's so fascinating seeing what has evolved of The Lord of the Rings as Tolkien's been writing it over the years. And this one was really interesting, especially the lengthy chapter about Shelob's lair. I think that was one of the greatest chapters. It was so interesting to me. I learned so much from it, and I really love this book, as with every book in this series. And then we have probably my favorite volume in the history of Middle-earth, next to probably the Lays of Beleriand, which is Sauron Defeated. And this delves into the final half of The Return of the King and how Tolkien wrote that. And it has a whole bunch of epilogues for The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien originally intended for there to be an epilogue in The Lord of the Rings after Frodo leave for the Grey Havens. And he wrote several different versions of the prologue, of the epilogue, but eventually he decided that Lord of the Rings didn't need an epilogue. And while I think that the epilogue that he initially wrote for The Lord of the Rings is very good, it's so great, I can see why Tolkien ultimately decided to not include it in The Lord of the Rings, although I feel like maybe if he had written through the epilogue several more times, maybe I'd revised it a bit more and changed some stuff, then it probably would have fit into The Lord of the Rings. But I can see why he eventually decided The Lord of the Rings didn't need an epilogue like that. But then, that is not the only thing in this book. That only takes about a quarter of this book. And the rest of this book, it's kind of too complicated to explain, but it delves a lot more into Numenor because Tolkien took a break around 1945, 1946. He took a break from writing Lord of the Rings and wrote a lot more about Numenor, or the Lost Island of Men, which you can read about in the Silmarillion and Fall of Numenor and a bunch of Tolkien's other books. But if you're unfamiliar, Numenor is basically Tolkien's version of Atlantis. It was an island ruled over by men, but eventually it was destroyed by a giant wave and sunk into the sea just like Atlantis. And also, the Notion Club papers in this book was so interesting. It's basically a fictionalized version of Tolkien and the Inklings, which is like the club that Tolkien and his friends met and discussed literature. And he writes a fictional version of the Inklings in the Notion Club papers. They're called the Notion Club in these papers, and it takes place in 1987. Tolkien was writing this in like 1945, so that would have been in the future yet. And it is so interesting. The Notion Club papers is just amazing. Some of the greatest stuff Tolkien ever wrote. If you read nothing else out of the History of Middle-earth series, read the Lays of Beleriand and read the Notion Club papers in this book. They are so interesting. The men at the Notion Club are having so many discussions about morality, language, and the lost island of Numenor. And it's so sad. Again, Tolkien left the Notion Club papers unfinished when he went back to continue writing The Lord of the Rings, and he just never returned to the Notion Club papers, either because he merely forgot about them or didn't feel motivated enough to continue writing about it. But Notion Club papers, just amazing. And then we have Morgoth's Ring, 10th volume in the history of Middle-earth. Now this is after Lord of the Rings was published, when Tolkien turned back to writing more about the Silmarillion. And Tolkien's heart was much more with the Silmarillion. And in this book you get more than just a bunch of different versions of the Silmarillion that Tolkien was trying to write. You get earlier drafts, outlines, and commentaries from Christopher Tolkien, as you do with all these History of Middle-earth books. But in this one, it also has a lot of stuff about the world of Middle-earth. Like, Tolkien did a lot of world building in here. It has a lot of stuff about the elves and how the elves live and their Fea, or spirit. Fea is the elves' body, the elves' physical body, and then Hroa is their spirit. Or soul, I guess, would be a better term for it. And Tolkien wrote a lot of stuff about the morality of Middle-earth, elvish lifestyle, and so much other stuff in this book, which I found to be fascinating. And then we get the War of the Jewels, probably my least favorite in the history of Middle-earth, but still a great book nonetheless. And it has a lot more of the writings that later made up the Silmarillion. And when I was reading this book, I was kind of getting tired of the Silmarillion stuff, because there was just a whole bunch of different versions of the same text that were essentially the same text, just with very small revisions made to it, like changes in name or just changes in punctuation and whatever. I found that to be a little bit boring in this book, and I was kind of getting tired of all the history of the Silmarillion stuff, because in this book, all of Tolkien's writings about the Silmarillion are basically almost the same as they are in the published Silmarillion. And so I was thinking, I've already read this a million times. But Christopher Tolkien's commentary on it was still very interesting. But in this book, you also get a chapter called The Wanderings of Húrin, which nowhere else did Tolkien ever write this story. This is the story of Húrin after he was released from captivity by Morgoth and his adventures. Now, in the Children of Húrin, we don't see any of this, and in the Silmarillion as well. We just see Morgoth releases Húrin, and then several years later, Húrin comes to his son's gravestone. But in this book, it tells about the adventures of Húrin after his release from Morgoth and before he found his son's tombstone. And that was fascinating. I love this book as well. Just in my opinion, probably my least favorite in the history of Middle-earth. But the chapter called The Wanderings of Húrin really made up for a lot of it. And then finally we come to The Peoples of Middle-earth, the 12th and final volume in the history of Middle-earth. Now this book was so interesting. It delved into the history of the appendices. In the back of The Lord of the Rings there are a bunch of appendices, which, by the way, go read the appendices. If you've read The Lord of the Rings but you haven't read the appendices, then you're really missing out. It's some great stuff. But this delves into the history of the appendices, how Tolkien wrote it, what evolved. I especially found the chapter on the Hobbit names to be very interesting. Like, originally, all the hobbits had Roman names. Like, you would find hobbits named, Marcus and Magnus and all this. And it's really interesting to see how Tolkien's idea of the names of the hobbits evolved over time. And then in the back of this book, you get so much fascinating stuff. Especially this one chapter called The New Shadow. Now, The New Shadow is Tolkien's unfinished sequel to The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien started writing a sequel to The Lord of the Rings, taking place in the 4th age of Middle-earth. And he unfortunately wrote about 20 pages of it, and then gave up on it. But it's called The New Shadow. And those 20 pages were so fascinating. It's a lot different from The Lord of the Rings. In fact, it's a lot different from Tolkien's normal writings. It feels more like something a writer like H.G. Wells or maybe Bram Stoker or Mary Shelley would write, and it doesn't really feel like a thing that Tolkien would write. But it was so interesting, just very different from anything Tolkien's ever written. And I can definitely see why he abandoned it, but it's so fascinating, the unfinished sequel to Lord of the Rings that's only 12 pages long. But I can see why Tolkien abandoned it. And then we also have this short story called Tal Elmar, which is the story of these men on Middle-earth seeing the Númenóreans come on their ships to Middle-earth for the first time, told from the men of Middle-earth's perspective, which I found to be so interesting. This book, just absolutely amazing, especially The New Shadow. The New Shadow was the most fascinating and interesting piece of this book. So there, after 1.5 years, I finally finished all 12 volumes in the history of Middle-earth. Now, like I said, the reason I read it so slow is that it's not a series you can speed read. It is not one cohesive story. It is much more literary history, and it is very dry and tedious at times. And I was bored several times while reading the series, especially when reading like The War of the Jordan and parts of the Peoples of Middle-earth. But still, it is such a great series, and I don't care if it's boring, because I have so much respect for what Christopher Tolkien did, that he published all these writings of his fathers, all these earlier drafts. The attention to detail is just incredible. And now you may be thinking, like, what's the point of reading all of this? What is the point of reading earlier drafts and outlines and whatnot for the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, right? Like, the final draft is always the best version, so why on earth would you want to read earlier drafts? I think it's interesting, because the earlier drafts are so different. And it's also brought to light certain things in the final draft that I never would have known before. And after reading this series, you will never read The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion the same way again, because you see Tolkien's thought process behind it. You see all the outlines, his original plans, and you see how the story evolved. And just reading through all this was so inspiring to me, as I'm an aspiring writer myself, that Tolkien's earlier versions for The Lord of the Rings, fascinating as it is, were not that good. They were mediocre at best, nowhere near on the level that the published Lord of the Rings is. And I think that's really showed me that being an author is not just like a magical thing where you write. Like, writing is not a magical thing where you can magically summon words. It is hard. It is tedious. It is boring, as Tolkien said several times. Writing a book is a tedious, laborious thing to do. And this has been so inspiring to me as an aspiring writer to see that my favorite writer of all time, J.R.R. Tolkien, was not very confident in himself. He abandoned lots of stories. He did so much revision, and a lot of his earlier drafts for his books were pretty mediocre. Not as terrible as my first drafts, but still not that great. And that's been so inspiring to me as I want to become a writer myself, and I've already written a lot and published so far. And this really showed me how you shouldn't just throw together a book as quickly as you can and just try to get it published as quickly as you can for money. Really put some thought into it. Take time and think about everything in your book before you go on to revise it and publish it, because Tolkien put just so much thought behind Middle-earth. And I think the primary thing that reading through the entire history of Middle-earth back to back has done is it has given me so much more of an appreciation for what Tolkien did. The world of Middle-earth is just truly incredible. It is so vast. It is so deep. There is so much more to it than most people realize if they've just read The Lord of the Rings. As good as The Lord of the Rings is, it is just the tip of the iceberg to Tolkien's writings and to Middle-earth. This series has been incredible, and I don't know if it's one that I would recommend to a lot of people because, like, it's very long. It is 5,000 pages, and it's not like a story or anything. It's more literary history, and it can be very dry and tedious and boring at times. But for me, I love this series. It was so fascinating, so interesting, so interesting, so interesting, so interesting, so interesting,
so interesting.
And to anyone who's a Tolkien fan, who's read the Silmarillion, who's read The Lord of the Rings, who is familiar with all of Tolkien's canon published works, I would recommend The History of Middle-earth. And if you're more familiar with The Lord of the Rings, then you can read volumes 6 through 9 in The History of Middle-earth, where you get earlier drafts and outlines for Lord of the Rings. I think that you'll find it very interesting. Now for me, I loved this series, and I will never forget my experience reading it. It took me 1.5 years. It was a long journey. It was a hard one at times, but in the end, it was so worth it. I love this series. I will never forget my first time reading it. Already now, I really want to go back and reread some of the Lays of Beleriand. I want to reread The Lost Road. I want to reread The New Shadow, the Notion Club papers immediately. And maybe I will. I'm just so tempted to go back and read through this whole series to see if there's any details I missed, which I won't do because it'll take me probably another 1.5 years. But this series was so good, and I recommend it if you're a fan of Tolkien's work. If you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, you can read volumes 6 through 9 first, if you so prefer, or you can just flip through them and see whatever looks interesting to you and maybe read that, like The New Shadow, the unfinished sequel to Lord of the Rings, or like the Notion Club papers, which has information on Numenor, or even The Lost Road, Tolkien's unfinished time travel story. If you want to just go through these volumes, sample chapters from them if they look interesting to you, and that's fine. You don't need to read through it back to back like I did. I found it so interesting. Read the series however you want. And if you read nothing else from Tolkien or from the series, at least read The Lost Road, The Lays of Beleriand, and the Notion Club papers, and The New Shadow as well. At least read those, at the very least. But I've been rambling for far long enough. This video is past half an hour long, so I've been rambling for far long enough. This is a very long video, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. And if you didn't, then just exit off this video and go watch something that you actually will enjoy. Or read this series. Hopefully you enjoy it. It was hard work. I had to be fully locked in and focused when reading these, which is why I couldn't just read them whenever I felt like it, when I was, rather scatterbrained. I had to read it when my mind was fully focused solely on this one thing, on what I was reading. And at times, yes, it was boring. At times, it was not enjoyable. But it was still so interesting, so fascinating, and has been so inspiring to me as an aspiring writer myself. It has showed me so much more about Middle-earth that I never would have known, and given me so much more of an appreciation for J.R.R. Tolkien and what he did. Tolkien still remains my favorite author of all time. He's been my favorite author for more than half a decade, and I don't know if that'll ever be changed anytime soon. But anyway, I've rambled for far long enough. Thank you for watching this video, and for now, farewell.